If you're reading Stoicism and you're like, the world is terrible, it is what it is, and I have this philosophy to help me not have to be sad about that, you're missing what it's about. I think this is the first thing I've done for the book.
Really?
Yes. It's a warm-up.
You have Skinny Confidential tomorrow?
I have Skinny Confidential tomorrow. I have Chris Williamson on Thursday. Today's show in a couple weeks, and I think Breakfast Club. So it's all starting, but
yeah,
I haven't done any of it.
Pressure's on.
Yes. People who listen to those episodes can look forward to hearing me practice my answers here.
Well, I usually would, like, in preparation for this, I would have listened to all of those and found, like, the stories you hadn't told yet. So hopefully.
Well, I haven't told any.
No, I know, but like.
Well, I feel like it's weird because I do feel like I talk about some of the stuff in it. Because like but it's usually like I'm talking about it because I'm excited because I'm writing. Like I feel like lately I've been telling stories that I've been researching about the book that won't come out.
Yeah. For
like a year and a half.
Or you thought you were going to use a story in one book. Yeah. And it actually is in this one. Okay, but so I found that thing I emailed you about yesterday, the story about the 2 cups. Yeah. The master fills up the cup, and he says, you can't fill it up because your cup is full, whatever. It's the idea that the cup has to be empty. To be a student, you have to have an empty cup. So I emailed Tristo, who is, for people who don't know, my research assistant before Billy, and he was like, no, it's definitely in the book. And I was like, I don't think it is. It's like I searched all the phrases in the book, and I looked where it was. Anyways, he was like, no, it's right here. And he sent me a manuscript, like when I type manuscript, I do everything in Google Docs, and then when I move it to the manuscript, I save a new draft every day for precisely this reason, so you can see like the differences. Right. And it was in there on June 12th, 2015. That's when June 12th, 2015. And then by September, it wasn't in there anymore. That's the exact story was in the intro of Ego is the Enemy. Okay, yeah. And I cut it at some point. So sometime between June and September, I guess I could go through the individual drafts and find the exact day. Was it, August 13th, between August 13th and 14th that I cut it? I don't know. Yeah. It doesn't really matter. But it's blowing my mind that I knew that story. I knew I'd written my own version of that story before, and I thought it was in one of my books. But since I cut it, literally that is the intro of a chapter now, because I just copied and pasted it and redid it, updated it or whatever, that will come out in 2025. Yeah. That's 10 insane. Years. Right. That it sat on the cutting room floor. You always tell yourself, like when you cut stuff, like I'll use it for something else. Yeah. And you never, ever, ever, ever do. And you probably found you read it first, however long before then. So that story has been brewing for.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know when I heard it for the first time. Yeah. You found the source you had is obviously this, because I asked you, I was like, maybe I didn't. So like, but I know this story. Can you find me this source? And that's obviously the source that I used when I wrote. I'll send you the thing I did, but that there's a phrase in the one you sent me from, I guess the story's from the 1800s, but it was written in the early 1900s. Yeah. But that's what I used when I wrote. So I would have read that book or somebody talking about that book. Right. At some point. Yeah, probably in 2014 or sometime earlier than that. Right. Which is crazy. Yeah. But it was in the intro. Like the book was built around it. Of the book.
Of Ego.
Yeah. It was in the intro.
Right. That's where I went first. I was like, because I thought I'd read it from you somewhere, but.
Yeah, and then now I'm worried. Now I'm like, what other things that are like that I forgot about that would be good? Right.
Oh, that you've cut that you might want to use?
Yeah. Right. Is there stuff that I don't even remember that I don't remember?
Like if Hristo hadn't sent
somehow,
you it, you wouldn't have found.
Well, it's also weird that he had like, because when I thought about it, like one of the things I was like, what's the I just pulled up a random manuscript of it, and I had like a copy edited manuscript that I searched, and it wasn't in there. And so he had like I had working drafts and then copy edited drafts. So like we were only 4 months apart
or 5 months apart in the drafts we were looking at. And when I looked at it, wasn't in there, and in the one he looked at, it was. So, if I'd said, "Hey, have I ever written this story?" and he was like, "I maybe," and he grabbed something from late September,
or if he was searching the published, like I was searching mostly things that have been published, not like
of course
earlier drafts.
Yes. Although, I think there's a story in Right Thing Right Now that was supposed to be encouraged, and then I moved to Discipline.
Yeah.
And then I moved from Discipline to Justice.
Yeah.
So I've rewritten it 3 times.
Yeah. And I don't know what the story is, but there's probably an argument that it could be in Wisdom too, because there's
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it was weird. It was also weird going through, for the we're doing some bonus chapters for the book, and I have some. I had to go find.
Yeah.
I was like, how do you find what you cut? I didn't remember. I remember one chapter that I obviously cut, and then I remember combining some. But I had to do the same thing where I went through and I was like, okay, I'll pick a random date and then go what is in here that isn't in the final draft.
Right. Well, I've been doing it with the bibliography, and on this one, I had to just go through my emails with you and find when I was sending you stuff.
Oh, right.
Now with Wisdom, I've started a dedicated document where as you're having me hunt down things, I'm labeling it and keeping it there for when the time comes.
Interesting.
Do you, so the story getting cut from Ego, do you remember the decision to cut that?
As soon as I saw it, I was like, I remember why I cut it, because, okay, so the story is about this master, a student goes to learn Zen from a master, a student goes to learn Zen from a master, and he puts out his cup, and the master fills, and the student says, whoa, it's full, it's overfilling, you can't pour any more in. And then the master says, yes, this cup is like your mind, you must, sort of empty the cup of your speculations and opinions for it to be able to take. And I said something when I wrote it for Ego is the Enemy, I said, we're so full of it. We're so full of shit. It stinks, which I remember thinking was a very clever line when I did it. And the editor, I think they told me I needed to cut it because there was too much cursing in the book or something like that. It was just some minor thing. It was too long, and I thought there's this line in writing, you're supposed to kill your darlings.
Yeah.
And I really liked that line. And so when they suggested killing it, I was like, okay, because I liked it so much, I agreed to cut it, if that makes sense. And so I think it was, the intro is already pretty long, if I'm remembering correctly. So I think it just didn't need to be there. And then, it gets cut, and then you don't even remember that it gets cut. And 10 years later, you have this vague recollection that there's something to this story.
Yeah. Well, the one of the things I wanted to specifically with this book, and it's always the challenge of any piece of writing or any piece of art, is the overlap between your tastes, what you want, what you like, and what you think will resonate with an audience.
Sure.
And the topic of this book seems like one of the harder ones to find that overlap, or and the title, you didn't go with Justice's insert. Is it intentional to? If
someone could tell me now a really good one that involves justice in the title, I would go for it. I mean, I'm wearing an And Justice for All shirt, but that was the working title, was And Justice for All. But it just, there's just something about it that I felt wouldn't work. I mean, this is the same thing, ironically, that I went through with Ego is the Enemy, is humility is not what gets people excited. And so you have to come at an idea in a way that entices people to care about what you're saying. In the same way that, the first line of a book matters, so does the cover matter, so does the theme matter, right? You're what is the way into the thing? So
But funny enough, part of the reason I sold it as a package, and like the better way to do it financially as an author potentially is you sell the first book, and then it does well, and then you sell the second book for more, and then on the strength of the second book you sell the third, and then the fourth. And in this one, I always knew justice would be the third, because you definitely don't open a series on the cardinal virtues of justice. I don't think you follow courage and justice because they're similar. And wisdom seems like the culmination of all of them. So that meant it had to be third. And one argument is that discipline is going to sell best. So that's actually exactly how you do it. You sell one, then you sell the other, and then riding on the success of that, you sell the third. And then knowing that the third will do the worst, you then, that was where I was nervous. I was nervous that, and this probably sounds unattractive. This probably is like the worst thing I could say to people who are thinking about getting the book. But I was very aware going in that this would almost certainly be sell the least of the 4 books in the series. And maybe that people would have the hardest time jumping into, or be the most, I'll get around to it. Because just having talked about Stoic philosophy now for 15 plus years, you can get people really excited about all the things that Stoicism does for them very simply. And then when you have to say what Stoicism asks of you, people are like, So there's a tension there. And so still going into it, I tried to think about what is the way into this, I think, essential Stoic concept in a way that most overlaps with what people think that they want or know that they want.
Right.
Like appeal
to self-interest in a way.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, like nobody wants to buy a lecture, and nobody wants, think about it, it's like when people think justice, they think politics or the law. When people think social justice, they think social justice warrior. Like it's got some headwinds.
Right.
But Stoic philosophy has headwinds.
I was going to say, like it's not dissimilar to the work you've done to like redefine how we think about Stoicism.
So I think when you go, one of the key Stoic concepts is doing justice. People are like, not only people go like, not super excited about that, but they're like, what does that even mean? But when you're like, no, it's essential to the Stoics that one does the right thing, right? Or one is a person of integrity or decency or kindness or honesty. Once you sort of break that term down, all of a sudden we're kind of talking the same language. And so I tried to go there.
Right. And it's the way the Stoics were using it. They didn't have the system that we do today.
They like most of what I feel like the Stoics talk about, let's take meditations. Most of where, like Marcus Aurelius talks about justice, like literally dozens of times in meditations. He also talks about doing the right thing dozens of times in meditations. And
the common good.
And so when he's talking, he means something closer to integrity, a moral compass, a sense of right and wrong, as opposed to like this list of policies or these 10 commandments. It's something closer to the golden rule, something closer to like this sort of universal values that cross-culturally we associate with being a good person, a person of rectitude, a person of integrity. That's what, of course, the Stoics are also interested in social justice and engage in, the political battles and arguments and fights of their time, and at different points are on different sides of the argument. But being a person, like Cato is considered the great Stoic because of his like high personal standards, that in a time of corruption and decay and decadence,
he's a person who keeps his word, who is transparent, who, fights for the little guy, where not always, but for the most part, sort of is a stickler for the law, duty, responsibility, those sort of just like old fashioned values.
Yeah. Right. And Marcus is like I think in the book, you say he uses the phrase common good like 80 times.
Yes.
And other variations, like a lot of times.
Yeah, Marcus Aurelius has this quote in Meditations where he says, the fruit of this life is good character and acts for the common good.
Yeah.
And I think that to me is both sides of the Stoic virtue of justice. So on the one hand, who are you as a person, right? Do you keep your word? Do you do the right thing? Do you assume responsibility? Do you treat people well? Like your sort of personal code that the law, like what other people are doing, what society says is okay, what you can legally get away with is secondary to what the standards you hold yourself to, character.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, acts for the common good. What are my obligations to humanity, to other people, to my family, to the future? How am I trying to leave this place better than I found it? That to me is the encapsulation of what the Stoics mean by justice.
Yes. Yeah. And he's not like saying like tomorrow we're going to go get justice and put that guy in prison. Like it's always in like
yes.
Reference to himself. Whereas like when we think about justice today, it's usually like externally, like, are we going to get that person?
Yeah. We think of justice as a thing you get because you have been wronged, right? Like I'm going to get justice against the government, against the person who stole from me, against, this societal problem, right? Justice is something you go to a law court and a verdict is rendered in your favor, as opposed to justice as something that you do as a person in how you treat other people, in how you run your business, in how you treat the environment, in who you vote for, the things that you like. Again, the core of Stoicism is like what is in your control. And so justice as solving intensely difficult timeless collective action problems, of course that's an important thing to do. If everyone just accepted the status quo as the status quo, we'd never have progress, we'd never get better. But there's something far more accessible and attainable that most of us ignore in favor of these big theoretical debates about what is right and wrong. Should we have done this? What should we do about this thing that's happening in this distant land or in Washington or Brussels or wherever, right? Like we're thinking about it as like, how should the world be, as opposed to justice is a thing that I live and act by in the domain that I have power over, which can be considerable. I'm not just saying like, hey, do you hold the door open for strangers? But like, you're a police officer, you're a CEO of a company, you are on this board of this nonprofit in your small town. How do you act with these ideas and ideals there was this suffragette, I think, and she said, it's not small the sphere in which we move. And she was talking about the way that women at that time, who did not legally have the right to vote, could influence things like the abolition of slavery and all these sort of major sort of progressive causes at that time, because they could boycott, they could protest, they could write, they could speak, they could do all these things. And so the idea, like, we all have a considerable amount of impact in the world that we exist in if we choose to act with it, instead of distracting ourselves with these theoretical, abstract moral discussions. Yeah. It's
a theme or a thread in all three books so far in the series, which is like how these things are habits that start really small.
Yeah.
In small like tests and small acts, and then those things build and build on top of each other. So it's like if you see somebody that's doing something kind of unethical or slimy, it's like what the steps they took up that staircase to like get away with that, you know?
Well, Aristotle says, you know, virtue isn't this thing that you're born with, and it's not this thing that you attain. It's a thing that you do. He's saying it's like a verb and not a noun. He's like, nobody goes like, how do I attain the virtue of home building? You just start building. You become a contractor by doing the act of building. And so we should see courage as this thing that you do. Like, that's why that expression of like, do one thing that every day that scares you, right? Courage is this thing that you build. And, you know, I think soldiers and astronauts and like truly courageous people would tell you they're not. Like, they weren't born that way. This is a result of the training and the culture that they exist in, which inculcated those values or skills. And I think this is true for discipline too. Like, I don't meet that many people who are like, I'm just naturally super disciplined. Discipline is something that you cultivate by like doing the hard things over and over and over again until it becomes easy, you know, or it becomes habit. And I think we can say the same about justice too. Like, generosity is something you develop. You're not just naturally generous. Maybe some people are, but let's say most of us aren't. If we want to be more of these things, we acquire that by actively thinking about it, setting rules for ourselves, engaging in the thing over and over and over again. And that's what the Stoics are trying to talk to themselves about in their writings, is like, hey, why did you do this? Why not do that? You know, and how do you do it better and do it more often and make it kind of a second nature?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's what I love about the Regulus story.
Yeah. I didn't know how to pronounce the name either, and I probably botched it in the audiobook.
Yeah. That he keeps his word and goes back to the captivity.
Yes.
But to think of like how that person gets to a point where they don't break their word even in that scenario.
Yeah, so there's this Roman named Regulus, and he is fighting against Carthage, and he's winning. Then there's a sudden reversal, and he's defeated and taken prisoner. And he spends like many years in a prison camp in Carthage. And then ultimately the Romans get the upper hand in the war, and the Carthage sends Regulus to Rome as a diplomatic envoy to hopefully negotiate return of hostages and a peaceful end to the war. So they send him, and he gets to Rome and he delivers the message, and then he asks to speak to, I guess would have been the consul at that time. And he goes, look, I know I just described, you know, exactly what they want, but I don't think you should take it. I think they're weaker than you think. I think you're on the verge of winning. Reject it.
Yeah.
And so the Romans do. And the next day or a few days later, Regulus is seen like packing up his stuff. And the Romans are like, what are you doing? And he said, you know, for them to release me, I had to promise that if I was not successful in the negotiations, that I would return. And I gave them my word as a man of honor. And he returned. And the reward for returning was not, oh my God, what an incredible person of character. It was death. The nicest story of Regulus's end is that he was crucified. The worst is that they had him stomped to death by elephants. And he knew this. He knew that's how it would go. And so we can imagine, you know, his wife begging him to stay. You can imagine the tearful goodbyes to his children and his friends. And they said, you don't have to do this. Like, you're home. Why would you possibly go back? Yeah. What do you care that you gave your word to these people? Especially, you gave your word under duress. Right. You know, like of course you would say whatever you could say to the enemy to get home. And then once you're free and clear, like all bets are off, right? And he says, I totally get it, but I gave them my word on behalf of Rome. And if I break that word, now some later general or citizen or diplomat will give their word
to someone who's taken them prisoner or in a negotiation, and no one will believe them, right? They won't. He says, if I return, I alone will suffer the consequences. But if I stay here, future generations will suffer. So for him, it wasn't just like, hey, I gave my word and I'm suicidal about it.
Yeah.
Right. So the moral of the story is that when we break our word, when we don't do a thing that we said, we're not just hurting like the other person, but we're fraying the bonds that society depends on, right? It's like there is a collective action problem. Why would anyone ever do what they say if it's not in your self-interest? And the answer is society depends on it, right? And so he has this sense that like, okay, I gave my word and it's good for me to break my word, but it's bad for some other future person down the line. It's bad for future, like think about all the times in modern politics where there's been something bad we know happening in an embassy or with a diplomat, but we have these laws about these rules, these standards about how we treat diplomatic people, and then how we treat sort of the sacred ground of embassies, because without that institution, all of humanity is worse off, right?
Yeah.
But I do think you make an interesting point, which is like, how do you get to a point where your word is literally your bond? Like you will return to prison because you gave your word. I mean, in Gandhi's life, he's given 7 days free from prison by the British authorities to mourn and bury his wife. I mean, he could have gotten on the first car, plane, train out of there, or just retreated into the interior of India in some way and waged his campaign on the run. It probably would have been a PR coup in many ways, right? But he had given his word, and I think you do that enough times, you become someone who says, I do what I say.
Yeah.
And again, this is all very lofty, right? It's like, I'm going to return upon penalty of death. But I think people have had the experience of like a contractor gives you a price and then it turns out to be more expensive. And they're like, this is your problem. And then you've dealt with a contractor or a vendor or whatever. And they're like, I know I told you it would be X. It cost a lot more, but I gave you the quote. So end of story, right? And like that person doesn't see themselves as being like some hero, but it's the same fucking thing, right? The idea of like, I honor what I said. I told you I'd get it to you by this time. I told you I would be there.
Yeah.
I told you there was a job waiting for you. Whatever it is, the idea of your word as your bond is a really, really powerful thing. And I don't think Regulus is some supernatural person. I think it is a muscle that he built. Right. And when you look at really strong people, you're like, how the fuck do they do that? And I don't think it's that different when you look at someone do something that demands so much character.
Yeah.
It's from the work that they did.
Yeah. Like a marathon runner at one point made the decision to first just like run around the block.
Yes.
And then like build on top of that.
Yes.
And that's where I meant with like Regulus, it's like work backwards to all the little things that build up to.
I tell the story in the book that I love about this poet named Danielle de Prima, who's at this party with Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, and they're like the sort of literary lions, and she's this aspiring poet. And it's this great party. It goes, looks like it's going to go on for hours. It's probably great for, fun and networking. And she gets up to leave, and they're like, "Where are you going?" And she says, I got to go relieve my babysitter. I told her I'd be home by 10. And Jack Kerouac says, if you don't forget about that babysitter, you're finished as a writer. He's saying like, to be a writer demands selfishness, and it demands you put the scene and the art and the inspiration above any other concern. And de Prima says something like, no.
if I forget about the babysitter, I'm lost as a writer. And she was saying that like the act of keeping one's word to the babysitter and to her family was the same process and required the same discipline as keeping her word to herself when she says like, I'm going to get up tomorrow and at 8 and write for 3 hours, or I'm going to finish this manuscript by the end of summer.
Right.
Like, I'm going to do this thing. And because I said to myself, I'm going to do it, it is the same as if I said to the babysitter or my boss or my probation officer, whatever it is, like I said I would be here at a time. I said I would do a thing. That's all you need to know.
Right.
And it's true. Like if you get comfortable lying to other people, you're probably also going to get comfortable lying to yourself. And the converse is also true, right? So developing this muscle of like this muscle or this habit or this standard where if you commit to a thing, you can take that to the bank. And the truth is people do take that to the bank,
right,
you know?
Right.
Like if you tell someone, hey, I'm going to deliver this thing by this time, or it'll be ready by this date, or here's my quote, you know, this is what it's going to cost. And then you knew all along that that was wishful thinking at best, and you're going to stick them with all these other fees as you go. Or you knew historically it never goes that quickly.
Yeah.
And inevitably there's going to be all these other things. Like they took that to the bank. That's how much they budgeted, right? That's when they built a plan around, right? And now you're breaking your word, and that costs somebody. It costs, I think all of us are jaded a little bit because we've been lied to so many times in our life. So that's a cost. That's a societal cost. Yeah. But then there's also just the cost of like, fuck, now what am I supposed to do? Like my third quarter was dependent on this thing happening this way. And you assured me it would go this way. You know, you told me you would have a decision by the end of next week. And now it's clear you didn't think about it at all. Like that's not free. There's a cost to that. And so I think, again, this is the intersection of like, I'm a person of good character, but I also understand that my actions have consequences for other people.
Yeah.
And so they are connected in that way.
Yeah. Or if the prima does break her word to the babysitter and she learns the lesson that like, oh, there weren't severe consequences when I did that. So
yeah,
next time she's thinking about breaking that promise to herself that she's going to wake up and write, it's easier to go, well, last time I got away with it. So
and look, that's how you end up as Jack Kerouac, who
right.
dies like prematurely, pathetically as an art monster.
Yeah.
Right. Like there is something fundamentally selfish about being a writer, for sure, or any kind of artist, right? No one is truly great at anything by putting everyone and everything else in front of that thing. But if you don't have some sort of code that you live by and some kind of sense of empathy to balance that out, you can spin off the planet like extremely quickly. And to me, that's what that story is about. She's realizing like, hey, I want to be more than just a writer or a poet. I want to be a well-rounded person. I want to be good at this thing and a good person. And so in that sense, the discipline is not just what you bring to the creative act. It's also how you behave as a person.
Yeah. And that story seems to be kind of an illustration of the way that sort of small things are indicative of like larger character traits.
Yes.
Like you have the story of Hadrian seeing Antonius in like this kind of trivial setting, and it's to him is like he's the right guy for the job.
So Plutarch's like the greatest biographer of all time. And he says that you learn more from a small utterance or an affect or an anecdote than you do from all these facts and figures, like where they were from, where they were born, exactly how many troops were at this battle, or every option they considered in this decision. That there's these little sort of moments that reveal the essence of the person. And that's why Plutarch's biographies are so incredible and everyone should read them, and why they've endured for thousands of years. And funny little side note, Plutarch's grandson or nephew is Sextus, the philosopher who Marcus thanks in the beginning of Meditations. So Plutarch lives in Hadrian's time. So a generation later in Marcus's time, that's the connection. But we can take it's a fascinating question. How does Hadrian, the most powerful man in the world, who was probably not a great person, and in fact is monstrous in many ways, he sets in motion this succession plan that sets up Marcus Aurelius to be the most powerful person in the world, but he knows Marcus isn't ready. And he knows Hadrian knows he's not going to live long enough to shepherd this boy and teach him all the things that he needs to know. So there has to be a placeholder. Later, this would become known as a regent. But how does somebody set up this person for the toughest job in the world? In many ways, that's the tougher job, right? Like, how do you hire someone as a transitionary figure? How do you set someone up to put themselves in service of someone? I mean, we see this in football all the time. No quarterback wants their team to draft high up in the draft another quarterback. Right. Nobody wants to be a mentor to the next. Yeah. And this is, I mean, you can relate to it, and it's also kind of a sad commentary, right? And so, but this is what Hadrian does. And he doesn't do it with like a multi-million-dollar contract. He does it with absolute power. He says, I'm going to give you absolute power over your successor and indeed every other person in Rome. And I hope that it doesn't corrupt you. And please don't kill this person right. and set up your own dynasty, that rules for all time, right? So how does he know? And we don't know. He doesn't leave like a detailed record of what it was. But like Antoninus had been in politics his whole life. He had served in every capacity you could imagine. He could do the job, right? He was more than qualified for the job. So Hadrian didn't have any question about that. The only reservation would have been like, does the person have the character and the decency that such inherently selfless set of responsibilities would demand of you? And yeah, we hear that Hadrian, walking in the forum one day, sees Antoninus helping his elderly stepfather up a flight of stairs. And he doesn't know that anyone is watching. It's not a performance. It's just a real moment of character. Here you have, I'm trying to think of here you have the Speaker of the House or Senate Majority Leader, or the Secretary of State, right? You have some incredibly powerful person used to having people do things for them, being just, in a private moment, being fundamentally decent and kind and helpful. And this is, may well be what seals the deal for Hadrian. And I think those are the kind of things you can't fake.
Yeah, right. Yeah, if it's less impressive if he knew Hadrian was watching. And
it's not impressive at all if he knows he's watching. Right. You know what I mean? It's not like and I'd like to bring my family up on stage with me, right. It's just, oh, okay, this is who you are.
Right. Totally.
I mean, the governor of South Dakota just admitted in her memoir that she shot a puppy in the face because it wasn't behaving well, right? These are moments where you get a glimpse of, oh, this is like, oh, I can relate to this scenario because I got 2 livestock guarding dogs that killed all my chickens. Yeah. And then they bit. I had a smaller dog at this time. I had this dachshund my wife and I had had since we first met. And the dogs would bark all the time. They weren't as purebred as we'd been led to believe. We bought them from a neighbor. So, they chased people. They bit my dog. I had young kids. It was untenable that we would have these dogs, right? It's my property. I could do whatever I want. It's unthinkable to me that I would shoot them in the head to get rid of them, right? Like, we found a neighbor who was willing to take them, and then they found someone else who was desperate for dogs like this, and then
we rehomed them with this person, and we paid for, first off, we sent the dog to these classes, and that didn't work. Like, we tried a bunch of different options. And then when it became, okay, not safe for here, we're like, well, what is a thing that works for the dogs? And then that's what we did. And I'm not saying this is like an insight into me being a wonderful person. I'm just saying, like you have something that you have an unpleasant, difficult scenario. This is where, if you don't have character, you do the expedient thing.
Right.
And it may seem like the most, like, I think what was so telling to me about that thing was not just that she did it, right? Because what she did it is, like, again, insane. Like, her kids came home and they were like, where's the dog? But she did it. Then she tried to put it in her first book. And the editor was like, this cannot be in your book. Like, you come off horribly in this story.
Yeah.
So it gets cut from her first book. And then now she's in, again, this is like weirdly more of a parallel than you would think. She's in the sweepstakes she's in the running to be the vice president, to be a heartbeat away from the presidency, right? Like, Trump is thinking of making her pick. No comments on who's going to win the election or not. But she's being vetted for a job, like Antoninus is being vetted for a job. And so she writes a second book to, like, get attention, and the book is her resume, right? And she's with a smaller imprint now. She's more famous now. She has more leverage. She puts the story in. Like, she doesn't even get that this is, like, it's not just the absence of character that goes, so we should just shoot this 14-month-old dog. Again, we should shoot this 14-month-old dog in the head in a gravel pit in the backyard because it keeps eating chickens,
right?
Instead of fetching pheasants and quail. Like, they're very similar. Like, I could see why the dog, like, it's okay. So not only does she do it, but she can't even conceive of a world where this is not only not the right choice, but it's a horrendous choice. Like a horrendous choice. And then, the condemnation is swift and almost unanimous.
Right.
But this is the problem. If you don't have that thing, and no one is saying this person's been a monster from the day she was born, but you can imagine, and I think this is something we're seeing on both sides of politics, but certainly in the right, where if you have a scene or an environment, and then you have a media culture that is celebrating brutality, violence, surprise, shock, like, how do we own the libs? How do we, provoke controversy? You could see a person developing as such, that not only do they do such a thing, but they're proud of it.
Right.
It's funny, when I spoke to the Los Angeles Rams a couple of years ago at training camp, I'm, like, sitting at this table, and her husband was there for some reason, and so we had lunch together. He seemed like a perfectly nice person, but I mean, he would have known about this.
He didn't say, like, maybe cut that out of the manuscript.
Well, no, I don't know about that, but I'm just saying, you meet a person and you're not like, oh yeah, you sleep in the same bed as someone who shot your children's dog in the head. Like, I'm now off on a tangent, but
yeah. The other thing about the Marcus Antoninus plan or succession plan, and back to, like, the analogy of the quarterbacks mentoring a younger guy, but on the flip side is, like, the rookie doesn't want to, like, sit behind that guy for the Falcons just took that guy from Washington.
Yeah.
And the GM said something like, ideally he'll sit behind Kirk Cousins or whoever it is for 4 years.
Penix, is that what
for 4 years. And then everybody's like, he's not going to want to sit behind him for 4 years.
Yeah, that doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's like, that's what college was.
Right.
Yes.
And then back to, like, the Marcus story is that took 20 years where he's sitting, waiting in the wings and just, like...
It's totally remarkable. I mean, it's unprecedented in the history of the world. And we have... These are the most famous... Like, we know the most about kings and power and succession
Yeah.
than any other thing. Like we don't know about that much about merchants in the year 1500, right? We know some, but these are the most studied, written about, portrayed, documented people in the history of the world, kings and queens and princes and princesses. And for most of human history, this was the only system of government that there was. And so it's totally unprecedented in the history of the world. Like, first off, you have 5, I guess it'd be 3 to Hadrian, emperors who don't have a son. Then Hadrian doesn't have a son. So he chooses Antoninus but breaks the chain in saying that, and I'm picking your successor also. But so here you have the 5 good emperors, and they weren't amazing, but they were better. We grade emperors on a curve, right? We have 5 good emperors who each choose a successor who is not biologically their child and gives them power. And each one in turn does the same thing, leading to Antoninus. Hadrian's an old man, very near death when he chooses Antoninus. So he has to live with this decision for not very long. And Antoninus has to live with the decision for not very long. He probably expected a few years, 5 years, that Marcus would have to rule under or live under Antoninus's rule. But yeah, it's 20 years. And it seems like not only did both of them not have a problem with it, but it was the greatest, most meaningful, transformative experience of either of their lives. Like, Antoninus seems to have loved it, and Marcus seems to have loved it, and both of them were like, it's over too soon.
Right.
And Marcus, I think, repays this, makes the ultimate sort of embodiment of what he just saw Antoninus do. There's this sort of third figure, Lucius Verus, who is the son of a previous person that Hadrian had attempted to set up as his successor, but had died. So Lucius Verus has some pretensions towards the throne, but Antoninus, as soon as Hadrian is out of the picture, goes like, no, it's Marcus. Marcus is the one. He's the most qualified. We get along the best. He's who I want to set up for this. And what does Marcus do, though? Like, the second that Antoninus is out of the picture, is he says, no. I'm going to make Lucius Verus my co-emperor. The first thing he does with absolute power is give half of it away. And it's sort of not remarked on enough, but that's what Antoninus also did. Antoninus didn't just, I'm the emperor for 20 years, and then on the last day of my life, I'm giving it over to Marcus. Marcus and he, effectively towards the end of that reign, are ruling together as co-emperors. So you have this rule: absolute power corrupts absolutely. Nobody goes before it's their time. Kings and queens don't abdicate, and yet you have these 2 kind of exceptions that prove the rule: Antoninus and Marcus Aurelius. And it's incredible. And again, I think, was Marcus Aurelius a good ruler? That's a question of justice. That's the virtue of justice. Did Marcus Aurelius, as a human being, act with this kind of profound moral compass that's, incredibly impressive? That is also that decision to not be corrupted by power and to share power is also a matter is under this bucket, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because both of those 2 are kind of brought into the royal lineage.
Yes.
And then Marcus's son is now he's in it, and then he is like goes back to the precedent of like
he proves
deranged.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But what is it about like that distinction between Marcus not expecting to be like that was not on his radar for much of his life, and then
it's just not, you shouldn't ever it's a terrible system.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, we know they had less history of it than we do. You know, we have 2,000 years and 1,000 examples of why it's a bad system and why it works on the people who inside it. Do you know what I mean? Like, we have more evidence than they do. I mean, political science is like just being invented, you know? We don't have the same, they did not have the same understanding that we did. I mean, should they have known better that, like, what are the chances that the kid of a good ruler is going to be a good ruler? You know, it seems silly in retrospect. It was also probably pretty silly at the time. This is why Rome was a republic.
Yeah.
And why Rome historically had a hatred of kings. But it is the system that they live in. And so they're not able to question it. But yeah, it doesn't go well for Commodus. It doesn't go well for Nero either, right? It's not a good system.
Yeah.
It doesn't bring out the best in people. And I mean, Marcus, we're told Marcus cries when he's told he's going to be king because his understanding of history has made it clear to him how many bad kings there are. And he's not sure he can be the exception to that rule. And we could imagine a bunch of alternative universes where it doesn't, you know? It's not that the people who are made worse by extreme power and wealth are simply of weak or low character. It's that it's an impossible amount of temptation and stress and isolation. I was just listening to this podcast about Elon Musk, and they were like, it was like, what happened to Elon Musk? Like, how did he go from where he was to who he is now? And the person was like, we don't have a lot of examples of people suddenly worth $200 billion and a lot of data on what that does to a person. Right. But it probably doesn't do good things, you know?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, you imagine how many employees he has. You imagine how much stress he has. He hasn't been in a regular airport in 20 years. You know, he flies private everywhere.
Yeah.
He has to be worried about security. There's not a single person that he talks to that doesn't tell him what he wants to hear.
Right.
Or doesn't want something from him. And you also have this thing acting on a person where if he had listened to what people said to him along the way, like when he started SpaceX, his friends literally had an alcoholic style intervention with him. Like, you cannot do this. You are going to ruin your life. This is the stupidest thing in the entire world that you could possibly do. And that company is now worth tens of billions of dollars and has changed, like, literally put a dent in the universe. Like, so it's not good for a person to constantly prove conventional wisdom wrong.
Right.
Because how could you have any trust in conventional wisdom or rules or basic human standards or restraints? So it's just not good for you, right? And I don't think many people make it out of that alive.
Yeah. In that Tennessee Williams, the
catastrophe of success.
He talks about like part of the catastrophe was like the removal of struggle is what he talks about.
Mm-hmm.
And how like in the relationship between a person being served, it's not good for either party, but it's probably worse for the person that is being served because they're just like without that.
Well, there's this story. Is it the Model X? What's the one with the cool doors?
I don't know.
The Tesla with the door, the Batwing doors.
Yeah.
That's there because when Elon Musk was designing that car, when they were designing that car, he had 5 young children. And he was constantly loading them in and out of the car seats. And it's a pain in the fucking ass to load kids in and out of car seats. The reason minivans are nice is because the door goes all the way back and you have easy things. But nobody likes driving minivans. So we all get SUVs and it sucks.
Right.
And so he had this fundamental insight about what it is to be a human trying to do this thing, and he invented this better way of doing it. He has many more kids since. I do not imagine he's loading the kids in the car seat that much anymore.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? First off, because he's gone all the time. And second, because he's one of the richest people in the world, and he lives in a fantasy world where everything is taken care of. Even if that's not true, the story is, the idea is like, it's not just struggle, but it's like just the shittiness of being a person.
Right.
And
like
the inconvenience of being a person.
The experience of living.
Yeah, you are stripped of the things that connect you to what it is to be a human. And then so, of course, you have trouble empathizing. It's like in Arrested Development. How much could a banana cost, Michael? She has no idea.
Right.
And so this happens to comedians, it happens to writers, it happens to entrepreneurs, it happens to powerful people. You just lose any understanding of reality. So then it becomes hard for you to give a shit about other people's problems, let alone feel compelled or obligated to do anything about them.
Right.
And you just get weird. It's just disorienting. Like the air is thinner up there. I have a line in Discipline is Destiny, because I was very impressed with Queen Elizabeth II. How did she manage to remain so disciplined and self-contained amidst all the craziness, right? Like when, as they say, the royal family thinks the world smells like fresh paint. Because everywhere they go, everything is fresh and new.
Right.
They're like, holy shit, the queen is coming. Let's make this the nicest it could possibly be, right? She's not, oh, sorry, ma'am. Like, it's a little dirty. We'll clean up after you leave. Like, everything is nice for her. And so that becomes this disorienting, unreal picture of reality that you then live in.
Right.
And it makes it hard for you to know what is up and what is down, what is good, what is bad. And you could imagine, in some ways, Marcus Aurelius being forced to be away from Rome in a tent like everyone else is probably part of what keeps him from being Caesarified.
Yeah.
Nero is not only in the palace, he's like, hey, let's get everyone together in the arena and make them listen to my poetry. He's surrounded by sick. He's losing his bead on.
And has no
reality.
one to say that's actually, let's not make people do that.
Yes, right. Who can tell that person that's a really, really bad idea?
Right.
Or that sucks. That sucks. And even if there's someone who can tell you, have you lost your ability to listen? Right. So like, I actually think the Cybertruck looks pretty cool. But like, you can imagine, let's say it's the dumbest car idea of all time.
Yeah.
Well, every idea before this, a lot of people thought was the dumbest idea of all time. And it became the most valuable car company in the world. So like, how do you know how to calibrate that?
Yeah.
It becomes disorienting. And there's probably some part of you that almost wants to take it like a child, wants to take it as far as it can go, just to understand what the limits are. Like my kid, I'll be like, don't touch that, it's hot. And my kids go, They just want to know because they don't know.
Yeah.
And I bet there's part of like, so it seems like self-destructiveness is maybe even a little bit like just trying to figure shit out.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting to think about. Like he couldn't have had the idea for the doors now because he's not doing those things.
Yeah.
And like Seinfeld and like Larry David, they talked about like they would just go out in like public settings.
Yeah.
And observe and just try to get ideas for the show. And then when the show got really big, they couldn't go out in public because they would just be like mobbed by fans. And then it became way harder to write the show.
Yeah. Your life ceases to be normal.
Yeah.
And you lose your bead on you have to have this. Robert Greene talks about this in the 50th Law. Like you have to have this direct connection with the audience because that's ultimately who you're servicing. And the more successful you are, the more intermediaries there are between you and that thing. And then you can even, I've known artists that have done this where they almost come to like hate and resent the fan. Like I knew this one author who like, as they worked more and more on themselves, they like almost looked back. They were almost like ashamed of who they were.
Yeah.
and because they couldn't admit that to themselves, they came to like despise the people who were fans of them for that reason. And so they had this like, not just an arm's distance between them and the stuff, but this like repulsion, because it was them unevolved. Do you know what I mean? Like they would, like when the person would come up and be like, I love your stuff, man, you changed my life.
Right.
They were like, they felt shame, and they felt shame because they didn't like the person that person liked, and they couldn't integrate that person into their life. Then they couldn't go like, I was this person, I now am this person, and I needed to be that person to become this person. It was they basically just sort of blew up their whole career. And I think there's some self-loathing or a desire for oblivion that motivates some of these figures sometimes, because it's impossible to express. It's really complicated and possible to unpack, but there is just this like, this just doesn't work for them anymore.
Yeah. Huh. Do you know that song Little Room by the White Stripes?
No.
It's like 37 seconds long or something like that.
Huh.
But it's like the trajectory of starting out in your little room making stuff. It's successful. So with the success, you get a bigger room.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's like, in that bigger room, like you forget how you got started.
Yeah.
And then you go back to the little room.
Yes.
But this, I've not heard this of like wanting to blow up because you're no longer identifying with that person that started out.
Yeah, I think often you'll see artists try to reinvent themselves because they don't want to be for the people that they're currently for.
Right.
Oftentimes to be really successful at a thing, you yourself were not balanced or healthy or evolved or whatever, right? And so one of the rewards of success is hopefully access to things or time or space to work on your stuff, right? I mean, imagine an artist who is now sober getting up and performing the songs they wrote in the depths of addiction or some partying phase. Like, you would have a weird relationship with that work, right? I mean, right. I have a weird relationship with my first book, which is like a version of myself that I don't see myself as anymore. But I've tried not to relate to it from a position of regret, but just a like an empathy and an understanding, but also I'm glad I'm not that. But I do feel like when people come up to me and they're like, I love that book, or I see what that book did for people that I don't like or I think are not positive, contributors to humanity. I'm like, well, what is that?
Or like the disconnect between what you thought that book was going to do and what it did for people.
Yeah, sure.
I was thinking earlier when we were talking about the Prima and Kerouac thing, and like how one of the rewards of mastery should be like you get more efficient and you're better at what you do.
Yeah.
And it takes less time. But often people like Kerouac get like it more and more consumed and have less and less time for things other than that.
Yeah, the craft or whatever.
Or like in Musk's case, it seems like if you read the Isaacson book, it seems like all he does is work on whatever it is.
So, sorry, what do you mean?
It's just interesting, like how that he should be able to afford, and he has the ability to be more efficient in like the work he does, but it's all he does.
Yeah. I mean, you'd think that you'd be able to create a system that was very efficient and effective that allows you to do all these things and not run around like your hair is on fire. But then his brother said something like he's addicted to the drama. That's like the fundamental theme of his life is like drama and chaos. And I've met people like that. There's just this like pattern that
enacting. Like Dev Charney at American Apparel was like that. Like, so it'd be like, things would be going well. And then there was this like cycle where he'd be like, I'm changing fucking everything, you know? Or he's like, we're all going to Montreal right now and we're going to reimagine things from the ground up. Or like, it'd be like, oh, someone did the math and built up this transition plan where we're going to move a lot of the shipping and distribution from this old 8-story building that was very ineffective to this like big flat, like Amazon style warehouse, like 45 minutes from here. Okay, here's the plan. We're going to approve it. This is the timeline. And then Dove like drives out there one day and maybe he got news about something or he was worried. And he's like, I want it all here by the end of the month. And they're like, it's not physical. He's like, fucking do it, man. And it like, it blew up his life. It blew up the company. I mean, he literally, towards the end, he was living in his office. He didn't, like Musk did at Twitter. He like put showers in and he was sleeping on this cot and not that he was sleeping. And it was just this like, it was this sort of manic spiral of craziness that ultimately sunk him and the company. That like, it's not only he shouldn't have done it, he shouldn't have, I don't even know if he needed to know that that facility existed. Like, you know, like, I'm not sure Ralph Lauren wakes up and he's like, what building are we shipping clothes out of these days? Like, he's like, no, what's cool? You know, he's like, he's thinking about the parts that only he could think about. But like, if you go, I remember one time we had this like fucking 3-hour meeting in Dove's office where it was like, I'd walked in and I was like, hey, like, what do you think about this? And then he's like talking to me. He's like, get Marcia in here. And then he's like, get this person in here. And one by one, he called like literally every executive in the company to his office. Yeah. Who he then talked at for like 3 hours. Nothing got accomplished. It was the theatrics and the craziness. It was whatever. And then as we were leaving, I remember Marcia. I was like, Marcia, what the fuck was that? You know? And she was like, you have to understand, Dove wants an audience a little bit more than he wants to make money. And so understanding that a lot of this stuff, it's like, it's funny, in Meditations, Marcus Aurelius talks about nature's inadvertence, like how sometimes things are the accidental byproduct of other things. Right. Well, this is also true of like deeply dysfunctional things. Like sometimes the deeply dysfunctional person is also, as a byproduct, creating art or business or insights or whatever, right? And it was like, Dove really wanted like an audience and a scene, and he wanted power and he wanted women. He wanted all these things. And it was like the desire for that accidentally created an enormous fashion company. Right. You know? And then the desire for those things ultimately destroyed said company. And so if what you actually need is like drama, excitement, urgency, incredibly complex problems, I mean, most of the time that kills you or, you know, leads nowhere. But one time out of a billion, it makes you a billionaire. Right. And so it's like, what is the force that's compelling or motivating a person? This is all funny because this is in the next book.
Well, like, you also have the North Star chapter.
Yeah, that's true.
In this book.
Yeah, that's true.
Where and it sounds like
Dove Charney?
Yeah. Yes. And it sounds like what he said was the North Star. Yes. Was actually like the line about the audience matters more than the money to him. That was always the North Star, but he kind of like distracted himself or deluded himself with thinking that like these other things were important.
Well, yeah, early on, it's like he wanted to make a positive difference and he really loved fashion and he loved people and he loved doing things. And over time, though, in the way that an addiction kind of swallows a person, the desire for attention, the desire for chaos and energy, and then ultimately like an insatiable need for validation and, I guess, dopamine and whatever sort of swallows all of that. And yeah, the North Star goes from, hey, I want to revolutionize fashion and I care about all these workers, to like, I'm this slave to my appetites and urges. And yeah, it was a powerful force early on, and then ultimately superseded by a more powerful force, and it destroyed that company and
tens of thousands of people lost their jobs. Investors lost millions and millions of dollars. He lost hundreds of millions of dollars. And I think most sad, like the positive good that company could have continued to do
right.
as the largest garment manufacturer in the United States that was paying its workers incomprehensibly generous salaries, ceases to exist. And it has this tragic effect of like, if you were to say, hey, I want to make a made in USA fashion company, people would be like, it doesn't work. Look at American Apparel. Look where that ended up. So it's also proving, it's not just, it didn't work for you. It's like a nail in the coffin of even the idea.
Yeah. Well, it's similar to the Regulus thing of like the downstream consequences.
Sure.
And like him setting up the future to like be people that keep their word.
I mean, think about Elizabeth Holmes, right? So it's not just that she defrauds the government and defrauds her investors and screws over the employees who decided to work for her instead of taking stock options at some other startup. But like, what if, I mean, the idea is not insane, right? Like what if you could, from a single drop of blood on someone's finger, learn all this information? How much more information would we get? How much better and faster would we find things out? Ostensibly, at some point, someone will actually be able to make that idea work. But think of the reservations and the headwinds that they're going to face to make that work. So the cost isn't just to her and to that singular business. But yeah, it's like Regulus is saying, like if she had come out and said, I can't make it work, something's wrong, she would have gotten fired and they would have replaced her or whatever. But instead, she made everyone suffer. Like now that's like, even I imagine, I don't know this, but I bet if you just looked at the VC inflows to that space, like biotech period, I'm sure suffers as a result of it. Just entrepreneurs in general, female entrepreneurs in general. Just you think of the consequences, the knockdown effects of other things that were harder because of the fucked up path that she took.
Yeah. In hindsight, like we were saying how Antonius is like helping the stepfather up the stairs was an indicator of like larger character traits. How like early on when you look back was it like, oh, Dove is capable of
with Dove? Oh, that's
or just like example. A small thing that was like those two things are connected.
I mean, probably, I'm certainly people knew it before I even started there, right? And I should have known better. And I think what I have come to understand is that, like, okay, so I started working at American Apparel because Robert Greene was on the board, and Robert was like, you got to hire this kid, he can help you with a bunch of stuff. And Dove invites me to his house, and then he's like, come see me at the factory. And I mean, it's the nicest house I've ever been to, and it was the biggest factory I'd ever been to, right? I knew why I wanted to work there, right? Like, it's clear to me why it was attractive and exciting and in my self-interest to do so. But why does a then 40-something-year-old man who has all this stuff, who has access to the best talent in the world, why is he hiring a 20-year-old, right? And why is he entrusting him with all of these things? In retrospect, it's because I would not recognize things that his peers would obviously see. You know what I mean? So it's not that like we now use this word grooming for everything, which I think is fucked up. But like, I mean, there's a reason he chose young, ambitious, naive people to work there instead of poaching them from other companies.
Yeah.
Right? It's because he wanted, to borrow Elon Musk's term, he wanted people who were extremely hardcore, but not informed enough to see the insanity that was obvious to anyone else. And so that's actually the thing about dictators and cults and whatever, is by definition, they don't attract the best people. They attract first the people who have some sort of affection or attraction to people like that. And I can kind of see in my own family, like different people have worked in places like for similar figures. But like, so there's something about just how I grew up that was like, when I saw that, I wasn't like, get me away from that guy. I was like, I want to work there.
Right.
But then also they self-select for the people who are either willing to turn away or to not see what is obvious to other people, you know? I think James Comey talked about this, like his first day in the Trump administration, he walks in with a bunch of people and Trump is like, that was the biggest inauguration crowd in history, wasn't it? Right? Like, and he's like, in that moment, Trump is deliberately or not, like whether it's just a habit he's cultivated to feed his own ego, or he's much more diabolical in the way like maybe a Putin would do. He's going like, will you willfully deny reality because it's what I want from you? Right. You know, like, will you tell me what I want to hear more than what your own two eyes in front of you are obviously telling you? And there's some people that will and some people that won't. And the people that won't, he knows are going to be a problem for him at some point.
Yeah.
That's your Alexander Vindmans, that's your James Mattis's, that's your McMasters, that's your Rex Tillerson. That's all the people who ultimately resign or quit or turn against him. And the ones who are still with him are still with him. And the same is true for Dove. Like, there are still people, despite him blowing up American Apparel and doing all the things that he did, that still work for him and think that he's the victim in what happened. And like, he probably thought I was one of those people, and he thought a lot of other people were those people, and it turns out they weren't. But that's the selection. Like, there's a Voltaire quote. He says, like, he who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And it's not always as extreme as that. But the point is, can I get you to debase yourself or to deny what your conscience or your eyes are telling you to continue to want to work for me? If so, you're who I want.
Right.
And I think there was a part of my life, I think ambition was a part of it. I think not knowing better was a part of it. I think a bunch of things were a part of it, where I was like, he told me things that in retrospect, I'm like, that should have been it. You know, that was insane. What are you talking about? But I was like, sure thing, boss, you know, or like, I had the unique experience also of working at that time for other people and then also going on and working for other people like that. And a lot of times what happens is you don't have the pattern recognition to go, oh, this is what they all say. Right. So like, you know, you work for someone who gets canceled or Me Too'd or something, and they tell you like how actually they're the victim and actually here's how it went. And people, you go, if you trust that person, you like that person, you're on their side, it makes sense to you. Well, when you talk to the 30th person that's told you the exact same thing, you go, they can't. It's like a defense attorney.
Right.
At some point you realize like, my clients can't all be innocent. Like they're all telling me the same shit, you know? Right. And so I think later I came to go, oh, okay, this is how these people operate. This is what they do. And I think that gave me some insights into Musk or to Trump. It also gave me insights into your Neros and, you know, your whomevers of history. Like, this is a type of person that recurs over and over again. And these are also the people that I remember reading James Romm's Dying Every Day during the takeover / restructuring of American Apparel and going, oh, this is much more familiar than it should be to me. Right. Like I understood it in a way that I think your average reader wouldn't, because like, oh, I'd been in Nero's Versailles or Nero's court. Like, I'd seen how those people operate and what they do.
Yeah. It's interesting to contrast it with, like, you just are looking into that Marshall Eisenhower story.
Yeah.
And how their first meeting came about because Eisenhower was like a young kid that told his boss that he should cut something out of his memoir.
Yeah.
And he didn't cut it, but Marshall kind of liked that he was like, had the balls to suggest it.
Yes, Marshall had Marshall, who I talk about in the Justice book a little bit, has the greatest coaching tree in basically the history of the world. Like he picks presidents and 4-star generals and people who win World War II, and along with a bunch of politicians. But yeah, he seemed to understand that his job was to find people who disagreed with him, who had a lot of potential, but whom he could delegate stuff to. That was Dove's thing, is that fundamentally he didn't want competent people around him because competent people threatened his control.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think Marshall saw something in Eisenhower that made him think he could shape this person, but also that he was fully formed enough that he was fully formed enough that he wouldn't be shaped into a sycophant. Like someone said that what MacArthur did, the fatal flaw of MacArthur, which ultimately sowed his demise, was that it said, the thing about MacArthur's staff is that no one could afford to be first rate. That fundamentally, there was a ceiling on how good you could be around MacArthur before he came to perceive you as a threat. And so get rid of that person. Either get rid of you or become alienated from you and
do what you weren't as good at.
Yes. And that's the real problem of ego, is that it can't see it as a team sport where you want to be surrounded by really great people. And I think Marshall saw his role as being a cultivator of talent as opposed to building an organization that worked for him personally.
Right. Yeah.
And ultimately, MacArthur is undone by the incompetence of some of his subordinates who don't serve him well, right? They don't tell the truth to him. And they also make a bunch of mistakes. And so, yeah, how do you your coaching tree isn't just this sort of generous thing. It's that you need people around you who are good because they challenge you and force you to step up.
Yeah. Yeah, it's another kind of similarity to the Marcus's story of bringing in talent, and you did that piece about when the plague broke out.
Yeah.
And he brings in I'm forgetting the guy's name.
Well, he has this great line in the beginning. Oh, this is obstacle. He has this great line in the beginning of Meditations, which I thought about, a lot during the plague, and then it struck me as a distinction, obviously, between the Trumps of the world or good leaders of the world, but also at American Apparel. He says something. Let's find it. Where is it? It's about experts. He says the way he ceded the floor to experts. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I think that's in
is that the one
book one, what he's saying you learned from Antoninus?
Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. This is all great radio, I'm sure. It says something about how he yielded this in particular, his willingness to yield the floor to experts in oratory, law, psychology, whatever, and to support them energetically so that each of them could fulfill his potential. And it's funny, he's saying fulfill his potential. I think Marcus means so they could fulfill their potential.
Right.
But I think the benefit of it's so they make you better.
Right.
Like Eisenhower and Omar Bradley and all these generals and young officers that Marshall discovers and gives jobs to and delegates to, they allow him to fulfill his potential, literally as the chief of staff, but also just as a leader and a human being. Like you benefit from the success of the people underneath you, especially in that case where you're all fighting and working for the same thing.
Yeah. It's also telling that not only was that a lesson, but he says it's the most important thing he learned.
Yes.
And you can imagine like another type, like a Dov Charney type, seeing that and being like, the lesson he internalizes is like weakness, or like, you know what I'm saying? Like,
no, I always thought it was remarkable, like how many people worked there and then how few went on to work at other companies or do other things, right? There's like a handful of us,
right,
that wasn't the like the peak experience of our life, that was a stepping stone, you know. And you see this, like, Trump's ostensibly this billionaire. He literally had a show where he picks like other great, like a reality show where he picks talented business people. Like Shark Tank, there's literally like hundreds of huge companies that have come out of Shark Tank.
Yeah.
What have the people from The Apprentice gone on to do?
Yeah,
right.
That's a good point.
What like, tell me someone who got their start at the Trump companies.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, tell me someone, like Warren Buffett has this whole generation of investors. Like, all the big hedge funds have people who, like, they worked for here, then they went on to do this, you know. Like the PayPal Mafia is a thing, right? Peter Thiel has an incredible coaching tree of entrepreneurs that have come off of him, and then also politicians and thinkers and whatever. You don't have to like all of them, but like, it's clear he is a cultivator of talent.
Yeah.
And it's usually a sign if a person does not have that underneath them. It means that either they were lucky,
right,
or they're inherently selfish and fragile, because you can't afford to be first rate around that person.
Right. Or like the things they do are not transferable to anything else.
Yeah. Yeah. I talk about Popovich in the book. I think Popovich has this incredible coaching tree. By the way, R.C. Buford called me last night. He wants to come here, and he's bringing someone who's a fan of yours.
Oh, cool.
But anyways,
Tim Duncan.
Yeah, and David Robinson. No, some sports psychologist who's a fan of yours. Utley, something. Anyways, what I think is so impressive about Popovich, his coaching tree, like, Belichick has a pretty impressive coaching tree, but they're all kind of like these mini Belichicks.
Yeah.
And it hasn't always worked at other teams. A lot of them come back and work for Bill Belichick. Clearly created an incredible system, not disputing it at all. But I think what's so incredible about Greg Popovich is that Becky Hammon, Mike Brown, Steve Kerr, these are very different coaches with different styles and different approaches, and have built very different teams. Like, it's one thing to make replicas of yourself. That's like, some people are so threatened that the idea of a protege is unfathomable to them. And then other people, they think a protege is a replica of yourself.
Right.
I think the highest form of it is you're able to identify talent, period, and then help that talent become what it is meant to be, not what you would do if you had it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it made me think of Bill Walsh and how he cultivated Joe Montana, Steve Young, a couple others, I forget.
Yeah.
But it's really only been Brady with that.
Garoppolo,
I guess, but he's not like a Montana or Steve Young.
Sure, he's been in the Super Bowl.
Yeah, yeah, but it seems like that seems to be an indication that like it was less Belichick than it was Brady.
Well, I think to look at Popovich and to have it over multiple eras, I think football is different because sometimes a team is built around a quarterback, and he got lucky in that he had the quarterback this whole time. But if you look at if you watch the Tom Brady roast, you look at some of those players. I mean, those are all he had a generation of football talent in all these different ways. So I don't know, but I think the less your coaching tree looks like you, the more impressive it is, and then probably the more generous it is.
Yeah.
Is I guess what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It was funny when I was talking to RC once about this, because I talked to him. RC Buford is the CEO of this person who was the GM. I was like talking about it as a coaching tree, and he was like, but what about, and he starts like talking to me about like all their like social media employees and like ticket salespeople.
Right.
He was saying like their front office staff gets poached too.
Yeah. He's like, and you don't know the half of it.
Yeah, he was like,
it's a real problem.
But I think he meant it in a positive. He was saying that as the CEO and the GM, he saw the coaching tree as being more than just coaches and players.
Yeah.
You know, like we hired this kid straight out of college to be a marketing intern, and then today they're the CEO of this company. Like he was saying organizationally, they see themselves as a cultivator and generator of talent, people who try to give chances and opportunities to people that maybe other people don't see, or open doors for them. And that, like, again, I guess it expanded my mind too. Like you're like, someone goes, oh, hey, like for me, if I only saw myself as like, okay, I've helped these other writers succeed, as opposed to, you know what I mean? Like, hey, this person this person who worked the front desk at the bookstore 20 years from now, I would like, hey, I gave you your first job.
Or like Braden, like this kid that was like, you know, it's also an interesting like trait of, because it's easy to imagine wanting to do everything you can to not let those people get away.
Sure.
The talented people, and it's like a headache, and it takes a lot of time to replace those people. And what it is about somebody that is,
I think the other thing we miss is like, okay, obviously, would it be better if the world was more fair, if people got more chances, if people didn't discriminate, if people didn't mistreat people, whatever, right? And yes, as a society, we have to come together to solve those problems, of course, right? This is what politics is about and the legal system is about. But like, there's also just like, what are you doing as a person in the sphere that you contain? So when Robert F. Kennedy takes over the Justice Department, he makes civil rights a priority. So he's going and he's saying like, you know, University of Mississippi, why you can't discriminate against Black students that want to come there. And you can't segregate. He's like, and the refrain amongst a lot of Southern governors and politicians and university presidents at that time was, but how many Black people work in the Justice Department? You're saying that our system is unfair and unjust, but you, where you actually have control over it, are actually operating under the same assumptions. We think the same thing. You don't mean this. And so he had to go, oh yeah, like, here I have real hiring and firing power. How am I going to do that first?
Yeah.
Right. Now, they were arguing this in bad faith because they didn't want the Justice Department to be integrated and diverse either. But he understood like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm going to have to fight tooth and nail for every university student in the South, for every, the person who works at the post office. Like, I'm going to desegregate the South is going to be this incredibly difficult legal battle. But who am I hiring in my office right now?
Yeah, let's start there.
Let's start there, and also let's not let ourselves off the hook, because our heart might be in the right place, but look at the situation around me. Do I actually believe this and hold this to be true, or is this a standard I'm holding other people to? And I think that's this fundamental thing. Like, justice is not this thing. Just as discipline is not this thing that you enforce on other people. It ultimately has to start with you. So Stoicism going, well, what part of this is in my control? What can I do right now?
Yeah. This is a little bit of a leap maybe, but it came to mind. The Taylor Swift story of like the music industry and her masters, and initially like speaking out about it, but then Kelly Clarkson's like, hey, you could do this.
Yeah.
You have this control. And she starts like,
I'll just re-record my masters.
Yeah.
Although the irony is
that now, from what I understand, like labels are closing that loophole. Like she did it so brilliantly, and so like made it clear how fucked up the system was that now they're like, we'll never let someone do that to us again.
Yeah.
But yeah, right. Like you can rage against the injustice of a situation and the unfairness of it generally, but at some point you got to decide, well, where do I have some power here?
Yeah.
And what can I do about it?
Yeah. I was reading, have you ever read anything by Eric Hoffer?
Yeah.
He came up when you had me look into some Eisenhower stuff. Eisenhower like mentioned his book, The True Believer or something.
He's also in the wisdom book because General Mattis hitchhikes as a kid to go to an Eric Hoffer book signing. And
wow, I remember that story.
And
I forgot that was Hoffer.
He asks Hoffer for some advice, and Hoffer says, write down everything interesting that you find.
Yeah.
And that's how he starts this habit of notebooks. Hoffer actually did it with note cards. They're at Stanford, there's like hundreds of file cabinets full of note cards. I told Mattis this. I was like, I don't know if you know this, but like it came full circle because he's at the Hoover Institute. So I was like, you got to go check him out.
Did he go?
I don't know if he went, but like the idea of like Hoffer as this sort of longshoreman, philosopher, cultivator of wisdom is very fascinating.
Yeah, super fascinating guy. But there's a book, I forget, it's like The Passionate State of Mind and Other Aphorisms or something like that. And he has this line in there about like it just may be that a perfect society is a stagnant society.
Okay.
And like if you think about who like revolutionaries were acting on what they perceive to be an injustice against them. But then like if you think of why an artist makes what they make or why anyone does what they do is to solve some sort of problem or injustice that is being imposed against them.
Well, that is the fundamental misunderstanding of Stoicism, that because Stoicism or the Stoics resign themselves to things that are outside of their control, they're somehow apathetic politically,
right,
or disengaged from the world. But in fact, not just in ancient history, you have this thing called the Stoic opposition who defies Nero and a bunch of the other terrible emperors, in fact, gives their lives like in protest, or is forcibly executed for their resistance to this sort of tyranny. For your Seneca-like collaborators, we also have the contrast of Thrasea, who's this like freedom fighter, like resistance figure. But the philosophy that inspires the American founders more than anything is Stoicism. They're inspired by Cato most of all, this figure who says, I do not accept that this is how the direction that things are going. This is how it should be. And they invent a new nation. I mean, it's called the revolution. They invent a new system of government. They change the world. Did they accept a bunch of things and injustices from their time that they shouldn't have accepted? Of course. But they also, the best of them challenged that in their own way too. I mean, Washington is slowly comes to understand slavery differently and is one of the few founders who frees all his slaves upon his death. But the idea of them being apathetic politically is belied by all the major moments of the time that they're involved in. There's this translator of Epictetus, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who I've been reading a lot about, who is not just involved, like he's one of the supporters of John Brown. He is this intense activist against the fugitive slave law and is radicalized by watching sort of northern slave catchers come into Boston and take people back into slavery. And so he leads one of the first black troops in the black regiments in the American Civil War. So like the Stoics have always been incredibly engaged politically and in pursuit of justice. Were they also realists and pragmatists? Yeah, of course. But to them, the contrast between the Stoics and the Epicureans was that the Epicureans sort of retreat into inward personal development. And the Stoics, for all their interest in inward personal development, ultimately thought that those were skills, mastery of one's emotions, all the things that go into being Stoic is what you needed if you were in the arena, literally and figuratively. So I just hate this idea that Stoicism is this acceptance. Like
there's this quote where it's like, the rational man adapts himself to the world. The irrational man tries to adapt the world to him. He says, so therefore, all progress depends on the irrational man. And so there is this rational component to Stoicism, but there's also this fundamentally irrational part. Like, Cato is crazy right. that he thinks he can withstand the forces of change and tyranny of his time. But he says, fuck it, I'm going to try. You know, like the founding of America is insane.
Totally, yeah.
And so Stoicism is not tamponing down that insanity. It's helping them keep their head about them in the midst of that insanity.
Yeah.
So there is like the idea that you're going to eradicate slavery as an institution, which has existed throughout human history, is insane. And yet, instead of accepting that it's insane, Higginson is using Stoicism to manage himself inside the insanity, which he is attempting to eradicate or resolve.
Yeah.
So I just think it's really, if you're reading Stoicism and you're like, the world is terrible, it is what it is, and I have this philosophy to help me not have to be sad about that, you're missing what it's about.
Yeah. I often think about the founders and how just insane what they pulled off really was when you like kind of think about it.
I think I talk about this in Courage is Calling, but like when you look at the average age, it's even more insane.
Yeah.
Just the idea that they would do that, and I'm not sure it had really ever been done before. The idea of like a colony breaking off and becoming its own thing.
And just taking on like the great like power of the time.
Yeah.
Like a bunch of kids just like, hey, let's.
Yeah, they were like, the oldest one was like 30. Yeah. Like it was insane. It was insane.
I think it's encouraged the story of, I forget who, Benjamin Rush or something like that. It's like the anniversary of the day they decided they were going to do it. And he's like, I just can't like escape the thought of like being in that room and knowing we were signing our death warrants.
Yeah, because in retrospect, it works out. So you go, they obviously knew this was great. It was, that we see it as this monument of, you know, legal thinking.
Yeah.
Right? Like they came up with this idea and it's so smart, as opposed to, yeah, you have these guys walking into a room betting their life. Literally, by signing their thing, he says, yeah, each of us was signing our own death warrant.
Yeah.
And our hands trembled as we did it. Yeah, the sheer courage of that and irrationality of that. And yet somehow it squares with their understanding of classical virtue.
Yeah.
I think is very lovely and important.
And just like how fed up you have to be with the injustice or like what you perceive to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I tell the story in this book about Thomas Clarkson, who basically invents the abolition movement from scratch in Britain at roughly the same time.
Yeah.
And that these 12 people just get together from these different backgrounds with basically no political experience. And again, that they're able to say that this thing, which none of them have experienced personally, and negatively impacts their life in no way. And in fact, the wealth and power of the country they live in is built on the back of this institution of slavery, thousands of miles away. For him to go, this shouldn't be happening, and we 12 people can make it stop happening.
Yeah.
Is an incredible. And then to succeed at that thing, within a few decades, slavery is abolished in the empire and the tide is turning against it globally from one guy. And so we don't like the great man of history theory because everything is structural, everything is systemic, there's all these other complicated facts. I think we do ourselves a real disservice to understand history that way because yes, it is true that those things exist, but the world is what it is in so many moments because certain individuals decided to go left instead of right, or decided to
to get involved instead of not getting involved, or to ask a question or to make a move instead of the alternative. And that there's this Marcus Aurelius passage where he goes, if it's humanly possible, know that you can do it also. To see those figures as not somehow fully formed, men and women of destiny who have something that you don't have, but to see them as just regular people. I mean, Thomas Clarkson is a college student at Oxford. I mean, I guess that's hard. Not everyone gets into Oxford, but he's a college student at Oxford who's asked to write an essay about this question of whether slavery is morally right or wrong. And from that essay, changes the course of human history and saves millions and millions and millions of people from a life of bondage and death and destruction, and liberates, all the other people from complicity in that horrendous system. What did you write your thesis about? Like, what essays do you, and that so he has this moment, he's riding his horse home from Oxford and starts thinking about could I do something about it? And then he's struck by this thought that's so powerful, he has to get off the horse. He goes, I think I could, and not only could I, I should.
Yeah.
And that is, to me, that is as much Stoicism as mastering your emotions,
Yeah. What is the story? It's a similar, a person hears something, should they do something about it? They don't do it. And it turns out that it was a person that fell and
that's the story of Camus' The Fall.
Yeah.
He's walking through the streets of Amsterdam and he hears a scream and a splash. And there's some part of him that thinks somebody just jumped or fell in the water. And then there's the other part of him that goes, nah. Couldn't be bothered.
Yeah.
And his life is changed by this refusal of the call.
Yeah.
And that call is, I think, sometimes explicit, but sometimes it's not explicit.
Right.
And or sometimes it's life and death and sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
But the decision to get involved and to not turn away is, I think, where justice and courage, the two of the cardinal virtues, intersect with each other. And then the discipline is the not quitting.
Yeah.
Right? You think about how many years Clarkson fights, how many miles he travels by horse and by wagon and by sea, and how many court documents he reads, and how many arguments he gets into, and how much money he raises, and how many nights he stayed up till 2 or 3 in the morning poring over these documents and preparing these speeches and writing these bills. And then, the sheer strength of mind, but also the wisdom, right? All the virtues are inseparable in that way. But ultimately, they were equally dedicated and equally adamant proponents of slavery.
Right.
So justice is, to me, the key swing vote in the other virtues. It renders it either admirable or awful.
Yeah. It's all Clarkson wasn't the first person to become aware of how wrong that system was. So it's kind of an example or an illustration of you can commit an injustice by doing nothing.
Yeah, which Marcus Aurelius says. Yeah, sure.
And how many people committed that injustice because...
I mean, in the beginning of Meditations, Marcus Aurelius is proud of himself.
Right.
He says that I never laid a hand, and he names 2 female slaves. So at best, he's talking about physical abuse.
Yeah.
At worst, he's talking about sexual abuse. And he says this in such a way that we know he obviously knew that other people did it. And he must have been repulsed by it because he saw it as something that he should not do. And yet, with all this power, doesn't do much about the institution as a whole. Both Antoninus and Marcus Aurelius apparently passed some laws that prevent some abuse against slaves or allow them to eventually get their freedom. I'm not sure the specifics. He didn't do nothing about it, but he didn't free all the slaves. You know, he didn't speak out forcefully against the institution, which is a bit sad given that his philosophical hero is Epictetus, a slave who is tortured and abused in the system of slavery. So he's not exempt from his own high standards there. You know, he says you can commit an injustice by doing nothing also. He commits an injustice by doing nothing about it, just as literally every century subsequently doesn't really do anything about it. But like we all see things and we know they're terrible, or we know that they're sad, or we know we could see things. Like you could watch videos about factory farming and know more about it. Mm-hmm. But you know, then probably change where I eat.
Yeah.
So you don't want to. I remember Dove would say that about American Apparel. He's like, you can't buy, he's like, you can't make and sell a bikini for $5 without somebody getting fucked. You know, he's like, it is not fucking possible. He's like, I know what it takes to do these things. Like, and that's what Clarkson helps England see in the campaign to abolish slavery. He's like, there's human flesh in the sugar that you're eating. Like people were chewed up, used up, and spit out, and in fact died, so you could make tea taste less bad. And that's a big, when you see how the other half lives, and Jacob Riis said this, like when you see how the other half lives, you're then faced with this question, like, and then what? Like, and what are you going to do about it? And that's why we don't want to know.
Yeah.
Because if we knew, then we would have to do something about it.
Yeah. Or live with the knowledge of not doing anything.
Yeah, and then become the person who says,
yeah,
but I deserve a $5 bikini, or I deserve, I don't want to pay $4 for a hamburger. It should be $1.
Yeah.
And I don't care what sort of abuses are necessitated by my desire to get it at this price.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It like makes it feel like when you think about those things and just the vastness of the issues and where do you begin? Where does one begin?
Yeah, Mother Teresa said something like, when I think of the mass, I do nothing. Like when I think of the one, I get involved. Mm. And there's this. Do you know the story of the starfish?
No.
So this famous story. Maybe it's real, maybe it's not. But this kid's at the beach. Walks to the beach one morning and it's covered in starfish that have washed up all over the shore. And he's horrified. You know, this storm has washed all these living creatures up and they're dying on the beach. And so he starts throwing them back in the ocean. And this adult comes, much more informed, you know, experienced, jaded adult. And he goes, you're never going to throw them back in. What does it matter? You know? And the kid says it matters to this starfish, as he throws it back in the ocean.
Wow.
And so the idea that, if you think of all the problems that face humanity, it's hopeless, it's pointless. But if you help one person, it matters to that person. Right. There was an election in this little town 2 cycles ago that was decided by 2 fucking votes.
Right.
You know, 2 fucking votes.
Yeah.
2 people didn't show up and vote. And so this person won versus this person. And, you know, maybe because that person doesn't show up, this person gets elected and a new housing development that makes housing more affordable doesn't get built, you know, or whatever, right? Like this law that does this doesn't happen or does happen. Like these things make a huge difference. So if you think about the preposterousness of your vote mattering, you're not going to do it. If you think about, is it in my control to do it, yes or no, then you do it. Mm-hmm. And these things matter. There's something about looking at the enormity of the problems that's actually very self-serving, because then you go, well, there's nothing I can do about it.
Yeah.
And so I should just live my life as if it's not a problem. Or I should just yell about the problem as opposed to dealing with it at some smaller level where I would have impact.
Yeah.
So like
they say all politics is local, but the vast majority of people's focus is on national and international politics. Meanwhile, you know, what are you doing about where you live?
Right.
Why are you walking past a piece of litter? You know, why are you, you know, treating this person poorly? What are the decisions you're making about your business? I think that's been a weird experience. Like, as a writer, you know, you're only really dealing with ideas. But then with Daily Stoic, I've had this unique experience where it's like we manufacture physical things. And so, I mean, nothing like the scale that I experienced when I was at American Apparel, but I have to decide, you know, do you want to make this coin or this ring, you know? Do I want to make it in a factory in China? Do I want to make, it's funny, we have this coin about the 4 virtues. Like, do I want to make this coin, which talks about courage and wisdom and justice and doing the right thing? Do I want to make that in China for much cheaper and then have to ship it by a container ship or airplane, you know, thousands of miles? Or do I want to pay many times more to manufacture it at a facility in Minneapolis that's been in business for 150 years and pays its employees a fair wage? It's like a family-owned business. One is better for me, you know, to go back to that Regulus thing. One is better for me,
right.
And then one is and not better for the customer,
right?
But one is better for other, if you have a larger sense of what your stakeholders are.
Yeah.
Or you know, we made the Daily Stoic book at this. There was this company, we found them. They were in Texas, but they manufacture in Belarus, where they've been for like decades. Except for Belarus is basically like a Russian satellite that, I mean, that's where Putin could only store his nuclear weapons. They've sort of rubber stamped the invasion of Ukraine. I remember I was talking to Congressman Tim Ryan, who's on the podcast, who obviously had a bit more access to the intelligence than I did. And I was like, hey, look, Belarus isn't technically on the list of sanctioned companies. I could continue to do business, and I'm not nearly at the size like where it would, like someone would come after me for doing it. But I was like, what do you think? And he was like, Belarus is Russia.
Yeah.
He's like, your call. And I was like, okay, we'll find someone else. And we found this company in the UK that has also been doing it a long time. But it's not like 10% more. It's like 250% more.
Yeah.
But I can't sell it for 250% more.
Right.
Like, that's just out of my pocket. And it wasn't fun.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things you learn, the reason that you study people from history is you want to study people who had to make vexing, incredibly difficult decisions. Like Regulus deciding, hey, am I going to keep my word and die, or break my word and live in shame that only I would know?
Yeah.
And you go, okay, if they could do that, can I choose between worse margins and a clear conscience,
right,
and better margins, and it might be a little bit embarrassing if people found out?
Yeah.
And so you make those decisions, and it is a muscle. Like, I think part of the reason, like one of the decisions we made really early on with Daily Stoic is I've always thought Black Friday and Cyber Monday were super gross. Like, so you all get together as a family on Thanksgiving in America, and you're talking about gratitude and the important things in life and whatever, and then you go to Walmart and fight for a big screen TV. You know what I mean? Like, the contrast of like family time and then mass consumerism has always struck me as disgusting. But that's like where companies make a lot of their money. Those are the two of the biggest retail and online retail days of the year. And so I felt gross just philosophically, like just doing a sale. So like the first couple of years of Daily Stoic and the Painted Portrait, whatever, I was like, we'll just treat it like a normal day. We won't do a sale. But the sales were higher anyway, just because people were. And so I said, okay, we're actually going to use this slot to do like a fundraising drive. And so we did. I think we've done Feed for America most of the time. We've raised almost like millions of meals for it, right? Like I put up money and the Daily Stoic community does it. But mostly the opportunity cost of that slot is the pricing, is the expensive thing, right? And so, the first year, the point is, it was practice making a decision, an expensive decision, an expensive but right decision. It was practice making an expensive right decision.
Yeah.
And you get used to it. You go, hey, I'm a person who makes expensive but right decisions. Like where I would rather say no to this and be proud of myself than say yes and feel a little gross. And I know that this is a thing you can develop because I was not always that person. I think about people that I've worked for and things that I've said yes to, and I wish that I had done it differently. And it was hard for me to even consider saying no to them at different points in my life. And just this year, I turned down a ton of money to speak at this conference from this person who I think is a fucking crook, he's not literally a crook. Like what he does is not illegal or has not currently been indicted or charged for it. I think he's also gross, and I think he's like a scammer. And he offered me a bunch of money to do this thing, and I was like, which should be the benefit of success is the ability to do that. And I don't fault people who like they're doing it. Well, I do, but it's one thing if you're doing it to survive.
Yeah.
But like the point of your success should be it should put you in a position to make better decisions. So like, what's the point of having the better margins if you can afford not having the better margins? Is how I thought about it. And so that's a muscle that I built over time. If I had to make that decision in 2010, definitely couldn't have made it.
Yeah.
Could I have even made it 2 years ago? I don't know. But you develop it. And that's what the Stoics are doing in the journaling and the talking and the writing and the studying of history. It's to get to a place where you can, let's just not even say do it every time, but do it more often than not, make the hard right decision.
Yeah. I was going to ask, like, from just the process of writing the book and just spending so much time with this topic and the virtue of justice, like if there were any new ways in which you came to see like Stoicism or things that you...
That's a good question. I definitely see the Stoics as being more engaged and progressive, not in the like American sense of the word, but progressive in that like trying to change and improve things and make things better. And that's not the reputation they have. And I think I'm excited to help rehabilitate that perception, especially now with Stoicism being misused and contorted to sort of support this kind of modern day know nothing bro sort of, I just hate it. I hate some of what Stoicism is being made to rationalize and support. Like Stoicism is not supposed to help you be a better sociopath. It's supposed to help you be a better person in all senses of the word. Courage, discipline, justice, wisdom. Like it's a key, it's all around that virtue of doing the right thing, good character, and works for the common good, as Marcus Aurelius was saying. Like that is really important to me. Not always the most popular with the audience, but it wasn't popular then. A lot of the Stoics died with these ideas. So like, it's very easy to be like, I'm happy to publish an email that will get unsubscribes. And in fact, I kind of think about, well, if that's what people are resistant to or upset about, then it means I'm not talking about it enough.
Right.
I could certainly see a world where Daily Stoic would be bigger if I never touched on those things. And I can certainly see where there's a huge audience to be had telling certain people, mostly young men, only the parts that they want to hear about it.
Yeah.
And someone will do that. Someone is doing that. But it doesn't have to be me. I was I heard someone go like, look, every person is entitled to a lawyer, but that person doesn't have to be you. Like that's how lawyers think about it, right? Like the system is predicated that everyone deserves a defense attorney, But just because some morally repugnant, fucked up, awful person wants to hire you doesn't mean you have to do it.
Right.
And I think there were times in my life where like I felt like maybe what someone was going through was a little unfair, or it was still a good opportunity or whatever. And I would go, well, someone's going to do it, so it might as well be me. But it didn't have to be me, you know, and understanding that I think is important. But I guess, just understanding Stoicism at this deeper level, I think is very important to me and what I'm talking about more and more. And it's what gets me excited.
Was there anything where you would have you'd update from the Stoic perspective on justice, or?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I'm not really that interested in what the Stoics thought about like sort of specific things, right? Yeah. Because like when people go, would the Stoics have, like, what do the Stoics have to say about politics? Like what they had to say about politics was that you should participate in the polis, like in politics.
And they were mostly all politicians.
Yeah, they didn't, yes, but they didn't go like, here are the Stoic policy positions.
Right.
There's lots of, like I would probably disagree if Admiral Stockdale had expressed his political platform right now. Would I agree with all of it? Probably not. But his idea that a Stoic, if asked to serve, should serve, I think we're in agreement there. And in broad strokes, what America's role in the world is, what honor and decency and value, probably in. So I think if we think of the Stoics having a lot to teach us about character and values as opposed to tax policy, we're probably a bit closer to what it should be. And I do think, though, the Stoics, I mean, a lot of where we are today, I feel, is like we have a bunch of problems, and you have a group of people who want to deny that those problems exist or the moral obligation to do anything about those problems, and then other people who have a bunch of policy proposals, some of which are correct and some of which are not correct. But first and foremost, we have a disagreement about whether we should do anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is where Stoicism, first and foremost, is of service. Like the idea that we're just going to go, hundreds of thousands of people should die every year because the Second Amendment exists is preposterous. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. The idea that we should just let it rip in a pandemic because it puts us in vexing dilemmas between individual freedom and collective action problems, the Stoic doesn't go, well, whatever, you have to solve for these problems. You can't, and you have to balance these conflicting things, not just thoughts and prayers.
Right.
That's fucking bullshit.
Yeah. What about like the Seneca and like his his serving Nero and being there and like
this is the $1 million question.
With the modern like analogy of like I thought I could be a part of changing this person.
Yeah, are you the adult in the room, or are you complicit in what's happening? I understand this because I felt like I was that in American Apparel. At a certain point I stayed not because I thought Dove was doing an amazing job, but because like I'd hired people and I could protect those people. At the same time, I also like getting paid, and I'd never just walked away and quit anything on principle before. That was not a muscle that I had.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm just really sympathetic to how hard that choice is and how insidious. I mean, the afterword of Courage is Calling is all about this, how insidious the things we tell ourselves. Like when Upton Sinclair said, it's really hard to get someone to understand something that their salary depends on them not understanding. That is very, very, very true.
Yeah.
And it's also true that there have been moments in time where had a worse person been in that position, things would have gone differently.
You can criticize Mike Pence all you want for being a sycophant and an enabler, and that he should have known better, and all of that. And yet, if Trump had replaced him and there was someone else certifying the election on January 6th, or someone else who didn't stand up to the president as he attempted to execute a coup that would have been quite familiar to the Stoics, the Catalan conspiracy being a pretty good parallel here, we might live in a very different country right now, right? And so like Seneca tells himself, I'm preventing Nero from being what Nero would be without me. Seems self-serving and like flattering and like he's just a martyr or whatever. But the first 5 years of Nero's reign are, even at the time, held up by historians as really good.
Yeah.
And then Seneca's grip loosens. Seneca maybe does get caught up in things, but then Seneca does leave. And Nero doesn't get better. Nero gets much worse. And maybe Rome doesn't burn.
Right.
Or maybe, maybe it goes differently, right? Maybe if Cato hadn't killed himself and found some way to work within the system, we don't know what the historical alternative. So there's something self-serving about walking away also.
Yeah, it's like that line of you never know what worse luck your bad luck saves you from.
Yeah, sure.
So
sure.
Like maybe it is quite possible that if Seneca was not in there, like it'd be far worse.
Yeah.
It's also interesting how like there's not somebody as well known from like Commodus's circle of like the way in which Seneca is complicit in Nero's.
Yeah. That is interesting. I don't know.
Is that just because Seneca like established himself in other ways and like he's
Yeah, I don't know.
It's like he became famous as a writer, but and then people were like, well, actually, did you know also he was complicit in Nero's?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. The reality is very rarely does the adult in the room make a positive difference.
Yeah. It's like the Hamilton line of if there's a fire you're trying to douse, you can't put it out from inside the house.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Yeah. H.R. McMaster's, who's a fan of Stoics, he wrote this book called Dereliction of Duty, and he looks at the chiefs of staff and the advisors to the president, all the presidents through Vietnam. And he notes that even though to a rule, almost every single one of them had some strong disagreement with the direction of policy, either that it should have gone, that it could have been saved had they gone in earlier and with more troops, or that it was a lost cause and needed to be wrapped up. He said not a single one resigned in protest. And so how could the president not take from that? Every president take from that people were more or less in agreement with the policies.
Right.
And he asked one of them, and then one of the generals said, if I resign in protest, it's a news story for a couple days, and then you know what I am? I'm an ex-general.
Yeah.
But, and this is where the Seneca thing is so interesting, you weren't having that much influence in the house either.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
So it's very...
That's McMaster's book?
Yeah, it's called Dereliction of Duty. It's pretty incredible. And then the craziness of him to become the national security advisor to the president and ultimately having to resign.
Right.
It's like he wrote this book 30 years ago.
That was before? Wow. Because he was forced to resign from like some Rolling Stone piece, right?
No.
Oh, that's
McChrystal.
Okay.
H.R. McMaster is the general who was Trump's national security advisor.
Got it. Okay. McChrystal was But then
was a general for Obama in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yeah, and he was forced to resign, but then like went on and
did a bunch of other things.
Yeah.
He's been on the podcast.
So maybe that's kind of like what did they go on and do?
Well, yeah, Seneca's point is like, if you can be of service to the many in government, great. If you can be of service to your city, great. You know, if you can't do that, can you be of service to an audience, like through writing? And then could you just be of service to the community, like as a human being? Like, can you help someone, you know, move or something, right? Yeah. Can you feed a beggar, you know? And his point is that there's multiple spheres in which we can operate. Ideally, you operate for as many people as possible, but to not neglect the lower ones.
Yeah, the circles of concern.
Yes.
And starting with the most local.